All right, kids, let's go. Africa, post-colonial. Probably the last video lecture of the year. In fact, it's almost gotta be, at least for this year, 2021. I'm doing it in. This is a rockin' tune that only took me years and years to realize by a band called the Waco Brothers that it's actually about decolonization where, well, long story, but it really kind of is. And I'd never really realized that until a couple of years ago. If we were in class, I'd probably play it for you. You know, I include this big map of Africa because so far what we've been looking at is German West Africa, British East Africa, and there is a tendency, and I share in this very much, if this describes you, you're not alone in it, the idea of like, oh, Africa. I mean, I know people have said, oh, I really want to go to France, or, oh my God, I want to go to Thailand or to India. Maybe someday I'll go to Africa. And of course, we are talking about 57, 58 distinct nation states with a wide variety of literally hundreds of ethnic groups. In the Democratic Republic of Congo itself, which is called Zaire on this map, that was the old name, there are close to 500 languages still spoken, suggesting within one of the 58 countries a tremendous amount of diversity. Certainly, as we've mentioned, like in the periods of the slave trade, oh my God, how could people sell their own to European slavers? They didn't see them as their own. They happened to have darker skin, but they didn't see themselves as African. They saw themselves as their own group of people, their own, I guess we've become to call nationality. Basic, this is from about 7-8 years ago with these numbers, but is the second largest and most populous country. Right now we are talking about, 850,000. I believe these are old numbers to show you from like 15 years ago to the present that we are talking about something like over 1 billion people today or close to that. The numbers are growing. This is the part of the world that is growing the fastest. So plus or minus 1 billion people. I'm not quite sure why I have different numbers, but I suspect what I was trying to show was the growth in just a few decades. And it is pretty remarkable. The city of Kinshasa that I used to live in, after World War II in like 1947, there were about 60,000 people in Kinshasa, and by 2017 it was 11 million people. Obviously, that's extreme growth, that's urbanization and not just population growth. Surprises a lot of people religiously, particularly in North Africa, a lot of Muslims. Remember, all of North Africa, Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco, almost entirely Muslim, but you've also got a pretty substantial Muslim population in other parts of Africa as well. Christian population, to be sure, brought in by the Europeans. Obviously, Christianity, except for Ethiopia, barely existed until the late 19th century. And then what we call indigenous religions, i.e. animist, spirit-related. Quite honestly, though, like you'd find here in Bolivia. In Bolivia, you find a lot of people who are Catholic, but they also do rituals for Pachamama, etc. Well, let's probably find that as well. So those numbers are probably pretty fluid, and probably different people might interpret somebody's religion a little bit differently. A lot of poverty. Poorest part of the world for a variety of reasons. Life expectancy, although it has grown substantially, when we say as low as the 30s, that's really disease and HIV AIDS related. I believe the widely recognized lowest life expectancy at birth in the world is usually the East Central African country of Burundi, which is around 50 to 55 years, although, again, during an epidemic of some sort, like with HIV AIDS, it dropped there. And you may notice that there is a gentleman out there named Ziger Lutenario. That is Ziger Lutenario. When we lived in the Congo, my friend Ricky, who was the IT guy, who I just loved the guy, just loved him. And one of those bromances that you hear about. I remember when his wife became pregnant again, he said, I'm going to name him after you. I'm going to name him Ziger. And I had a good laugh because nobody is going to name their kid Ziger Lutenario. And I thought it was a joke. It turns out, and this is probably maybe the greatest honor of my life, he and his wife named their little boy Ziger Lutenario. So there is a Ziger first name running around in the Congo today. I think he just celebrated his 5th birthday. Reminds me, got to send a little birthday present. And by the way, knowing how things work, I suspect that idea that, there's somebody out there with a little bit more money who will be invested in this kid, not a bad idea. But there's also, I do know that in the Congo that there is a real premium on a name that no other kid has. And so sometimes people look for unusual names, and I will tell you, Ziegler as a first name fits the bill. We've seen this chart earlier in the year, but you're seeing where I just say stop this for a moment and look at this. Notice how the European population from 1750 to 1900, that's a massive increase. If Europe kept growing at that rate, that's a 2.5, we'd have 1 billion Europeans today, and we have nowhere close to it. You see that Asia's population was growing and then absolutely exploded after 1950. This is basically when modern medicine started coming, food supplies, modern medicine. You'll notice that Africa's population during the heart of the slave trade, it's not declining, but it's not growing. And of course, up till the Industrial Revolution, the more people you have, the more wealth you are producing. You see the growth starts to happen and then triples between 1950 and 2000. It more than triples. If that continues, we would be talking by the year 2000, 2 billion Africans, 6 billion, 8 billion, 12 billion. Of course, this is a projection at the end. Africa will probably, if it is not already the second most, it's already the second most populous, but you see the numbers. Why, by the way, are you seeing? This is cool. Wish we had more time for it. Remember Thomas Malthus back in 1789 said, oh man, food supply is going to grow. We're going to, cover more land, of course, but the birth rate's going to explode. As there's more food, people have 6 kids and 36 grandkids and 216 great-grandkids. And you know what? Eventually we'll run out of food and land and everybody will starve. And as it turns out, that made a lot of sense when Thomas Malthus was writing, because throughout all of human history, people had 6, 7, 8 kids, and a lot of the kids died young and didn't survive. What happened to the population of the world? And this is not over a few generations. This is over tens of thousands of years. Tiny, tiny population growth. Now, by the time of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, more food supply, some modern medicine by the late 1800s leads to a decreasing death rate. People live longer. You have 7 kids, 5, 6, or 7 are going to survive, but people keep having lots of kids. By the way, these people are moving in industrial modern societies into cities, and eventually what has happened in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, in Korea, is that people have started having fewer children. Not because the government says you must, although government can play a role in, promoting family planning and smaller family size, because it makes sense. If you live in the city of Santa Cruz, where, housing is expensive and education is expensive, and the children aren't producing their own food on the farm, if you want to have 8 kids, well, good on you, but it's not an economically smart choice to do this. So people naturally start having fewer children. The death rate maybe continues to fall or stay normal, but eventually, by stage 4, you start seeing the birth rate going below the death rate and population dropping. And we are seeing this right now in parts of Europe. Japan's population will probably lose 30 or 40 million people over the next 50 years because people are having fewer than 2 children if they have children at all. The key is that we are not, of course, yet seeing. We are actually starting to see. It says Kenya. You know what? Kenya has moved into this. Kenya has gone in the last 20 years from the average woman having 6 or 7 kids to having 3. That is huge. That is a huge drop. This is kind of our hope for the idea that we don't, do we actually start seeing a declining world population or a stabilizing world population if more of the world goes through this transition, demographic record of people, transition, change, model? It appears to be wired into human societies that as societies modernize, if you have 3 kids, they're probably all going to survive. Modern medicine and food supplies keeps track of people. People move to cities so that, it's not only that your kids can't help out on the farm, they actually cost you a lot more to have more kids. It seems that birth rates naturally decline. in all the societies that have reached that level of modernity? Is there something about sub-Saharan Africa that, look, I'm sorry, people will keep having 5, 6 kids like all human beings always had? Maybe so. Or parts of the Muslim world where population continues to grow. Are there cultural things that outrule this? And that we don't know. But this is probably, when one worries about overpopulation and limited resources in the world, are we running out of water and land and food? This is probably the hope for it. Look it up. There's some awesome videos online. Demographic transition model. Yeah, again, this is kind of looking geographically. It is a physical geography map. There are deserts, of course, the Sahara, the Kalahari in the south, the so-called highlands. You know what? When you think of Africa and you think of, oh, the giant animals that are roaming across the prairie, well, that's all these areas in green primarily. There are mountain ranges, just having a look. But Africa is very diverse geographically, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, historically, you name it. Very, very different. It's not one big place. Yeah, natural vegetation, I'm really doing it up in the maps here. Yeah, Islam dominates within the northern part of Africa. Mind you, there are mixes. There's like an 8% Coptic Christian population in Egypt, etc., etc. And notice, like within Ethiopia, which is probably 50% Christian and 45% Muslim, there are areas that are Muslim dominated. And then, of course, there are Muslim populations, filtered through, like there are any place that you might live. But North and South are, in a lot of ways, you could make a statement about North Africa that maybe you couldn't make about sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, the Sahara Desert is here. And that's not just a geographic barrier, but there's also cultural because of how religions and contact with outsiders has happened. Then here you're looking at life expectancy growing substantially in the 40s. And this is the HIV AIDS crisis of the late 80s and early 90s, and pretty stunning. Still, it is in some cases a death sentence in some areas. Now, modern medicine is there. I have friends that have been HIV positive for 35 years, and I guarantee you, Bill Boddick is going to die someday. It is not going to be the HIV virus. He has all the medication, proper diet, medical care. It's an inconvenient virus that is kept largely under control. In poorer parts of the world where A, lacking the medication and the treatment, but B, coupling it with tuberculosis or malaria or other diseases that are endemic that weaken the immune system. South Africa, these countries in Southern Africa are absolutely going to have to deal with this for a long time. A lot of orphan kids left behind at this period. Uganda, you will notice, by the way, saw a major hit but seemed to recover better. They had a pretty good public health system and public relations initiative that seemed to change behavior. But we don't have time for that in this class. Oh, HIV rates, yeah. Syria rates. Again, parts of southern Africa were thought at times to be over 30% of adults HIV positive. HIV started in the United States as quote-unquote a gay condition. It was passed along in various parts of the gay community. Absolutely not in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not types of people that pass on a virus. It's certain behaviors. Okay. Right, and this is what, of course, Africa looked like for a long time. You'll notice dominant French and English, larger population, France, larger land area, the Belgian Congo in the center, a little bit of Germany, a little bit of Spain, etc. And then we move into the new generation. Now remember that Asia largely was decolonized in the late 40s, early 50s. India's 47, Burma's 48, Indonesia's 49. I think Malaysia was still under British control until like 60 or 61. But that happened first, and in a way that makes sense because, India was a 2,000-year-old sophisticated culture where people identified as Indians. And of course, what you have in Africa is, some brilliant civilizations that developed here, but much more fractured. And for reasons Jared Diamond argued, of course, that this is really about geography, that, the north-south axis and the type of tropical climate that hits so much probably led to less biodiversity for animals and for plants, which led to less of something to build on. Doesn't mean that these societies are less, but they are certainly less modernly technologically advanced. And also remember, Africa was absolutely, the states of Africa were dominated by the Europeans in a way that India simply never could quite be. So another part of this. Why after World War II? I mean, some of it is, hey, World War II, it's a war for equality, it's against the racism of, okay, that kind of filters through. England and France, the two major colonializing powers, they were destroyed by World War II. France ceased to be a country for 4 years and was barely holding on. England was economically absolutely destitute. That's part of it. Westernized African leaders, that after generations of the elite from these African states being brought back and educated in England and France so they could come back and be loyal leaders, well, they didn't simply study how to be loyal British and French people. They started reading some of these constitutions, some of these political ideas for sure, and you'd better believe it, the fact that India, Indochina, Indonesia had all broken away from the West. Africans are well aware of this. Remember that fantastic conference in 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, that brought together leaders of like 30 countries, 30 peoples, I should say, including 7 or 8 Asian peoples that had formed their own countries and their own independence and had broken free, but there were also like a dozen or more representatives of African peoples that were looking to do exactly the same thing. And of course, remember, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, United States, Soviet Union, the Cold War. And this plays such a role both in the freedom, independence, and a lot of the violence in this period. Africa remains it's pretty desperate, but well, you know what? It isn't. I mean, I've only traveled in 4 or 5 African countries, and I've seen such beauty and energy and creativity and just all kinds of awesome things. The big scale, though, the 25 poorest countries in the world, or 24 of them, Haiti, in the Western Hemisphere might be the exception that would fit in that bottom 25. They're all African. And why? Corruption. And you could say, oh, it's the corrupt African leaders, and it's also Westerners who have enforced and promoted that corruption if it benefits them. But there's no shortage of absolutely ghastly, corrupt, selfish African leaders like any place else. The colonial hangover, you can say, well, these people were completely dominated and had no resources invested in. They were fourth-class citizens and denied an education, and they were stripped of all their natural resources. Well, they've had 20 years to become established, well-functioning democracies. What's wrong with them? Yeah, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. And when I say ethnic factions, you look at the map of Africa, those lines are nice and neatly drawn, aren't they? They're just straight up and down. What do you do with a place like the Congo that has literally hundreds of ethnic groups, some of whom have very bad histories with each other? Well, Europeans draw the line and say, hey, good luck, you're all in this together. There are a lot of reasons. I do think if you say, oh, blaming imperialism for the state of Africa, come on, that was 60 years ago. That's completely myopic and probably even a little racist. But I would argue it's probably kind of myopic and racist to say, oh, poor Africa, they are simply victims of the West. And it's not as simple as that either. Public health issues, malaria, AIDS, etc. International debt, I wish we could go into. But dictators in Africa were actively encouraged by Westerners to take out huge, huge, huge debts, and that ended up falling on the people of these countries. Stop me looking around. I think it's raining out there, Brian. And political instability, any one of these countries, major changes in government, they happen a lot. Ghana was the great hope. Kwame Nkrumah seemed to be a man of incredible substance. It was the first of the sub-Saharan African countries to declare its independence. And for all the brutality that the British put upon their colonies, the British did recognize, I think as early as 1950, they said Ghana, which used to be called the Gold Coast, will be given its independence, and we are going to slowly, gradually move them toward independence. Now, thinking back as to what happened in India with the sudden, okay, your independence starting now, and the chaos that happened, I think the people of Ghana learned from that and realized the British leaving tomorrow might not benefit us. They plan to be completely non-aligned. He once said, Nkrumah said, we do not look east or west. We don't look to the Soviet Union or the United States. We look forward. State-run socialist, small s, not a communist state at all, but government playing a real role. And Kwame Nkrumah and the others believed what they called Pan-Africanism. By Pan-Africanism, that simply means we, the African people, from our different languages, religions, and cultures, we share common interests. Not necessarily talking about a country called Africa, but working together to be sure. You saw that with the Bandung movement, right? 1955. We are all here to work together, to forget our differences, to support each other. Again, a little bit easier maybe to say than to do. Nkrumah increasingly became sort of the guy, the one-party state. Other parties were banned. We can't have disagreement here. We need to work together. Is eventually overthrown in 1966. I think it's probably Nkrumah. There's an awful lot to admire about him. Was he successful in creating a stable, prosperous, independent Ghana? No. Is there any one individual that could have done that? That's another question. Yeah, it's far better to be free to govern or misgovern yourself than governed by anyone else. You see the quote that I just mentioned? Look, we prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility. One of the critiques that's been made of the post-independence leaders, particularly in Africa, is that at some level they believed as long as we run our own affairs, as long as we're ideologically pure, as long as we believe in ourselves, the rest will take care of it. And probably that was a little bit naive, probably understanding something about modern economics and development, that simply independence was not enough. There's also a little sense, too, later in his career when Nkrumah says, all Africans know that I represent Africa and that I speak, so no African can have an opinion that differs from mine. It suggests the power going to the head, and he would not be the first leader that came from really noble background that became a little drunk on power. I wish I knew more about Nkrumah. I don't want to say that he became power drunk, but it's a pretty common thing to happen when you have absolute control like this, and you certainly see a warning sign there. Relatively little about Kenya. If you ever get a question about resistance or European repression, the Mau Mau rebellion, which is, lots of Kenyans dead. They're simply massacred. I'm not going to go into much detail about it. Also, a British colony, Jomo Kenyatta, took his name from the people, hence the name of the country, becomes this East African president. Again, Western educated, absolutely. He went to Europe to be educated, to be an elite in this country, and came back with ideas about independence, worked well with Kwame Nkrumah, the Pan-African Union, land reform, etc., and then once again became sort of a one-party state that limited freedom of speech, etc. And on one hand, you can say, oh, that's terrible, he just became a dictator. But if you're living in a society of desperate poverty with ethnic conflicts where, there are outside forces, both the Soviet Union and the West and the United States, that are, demanding that you do certain things and threatening you on all ends, it's one thing to say, I believe in complete, total political freedom for all, and then recognizing you're trying to hold a country together. I guess what I'm saying with all of these countries is really hard decisions to be made, and every decision would be imperfect. I think some of these guys, for all their abilities, didn't come up with the best possible solution, but I suspect most of us would not have either. Even the United States, just backtracking a little bit, it's like, well, the United States created a democracy from the beginning. Well, did they really, when women weren't allowed to vote or have voice for 120 years and black people born in Texas in my date in the 1960s didn't have the right to vote? Is this really the democracy? And, that's 150, almost 200 years, whereas the United States started out as the wealthiest population per capita in the world at the time of its independence. Are we holding different standards for Africans? Why are they not creating perfect societies in 40 years despite starting from desperate poverty? It's probably not a fair standard to look at. Rwanda, and you probably know the name Rwanda for a reason. One thing interesting to look at, it was a Belgian colony, landlocked, which of course is a problem, not having access to the sea, very ethnically divided, largely, most people argue, by Europeans. You have most people are Hutus. You have a minority of the population who are Tutsis, who tend to have been the economically and the politically and educationally dominant. And a lot of people would argue that it was the Belgians coming in that would look at these two groups, and there are certain physical difference. The Tutsis tend to have higher foreheads and narrower faces, etc. Although through most of the history of the people in Burundi and in Rwanda, you see Burundi to the south and into what is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, these are people that saw a difference but intermarried, lived together, etc. But Europeans, especially the Belgians, saw this as a chance to divide and conquer. Well, we will give benefits to the minority Tutsi population, which will make them loyal to us, which will help us control the overall population. And you're going to see how this plays out. Uganda, another British colony, little trivia question, that early Zionists, people looking for a Jewish homeland, had been proposing Uganda in East Central Africa as the possible location. Maybe it doesn't need to be in the Holy Land of the Jews or the Hebrews because we're not terribly religious people. Of course, there's the idea that this is open land that we Jewish people can move to. Well, there were a lot of Africans there. One of the poorest, thought to be a 15% literacy rate by the time of independence, largely Christian. Well, you see the numbers. Idi Amin is somebody we got to look at. Idi Amin Dada was his full name. He was a Muslim general who took over in 1971, and he is his own story. His official title was His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin, VC, DSOA, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror the British Empire in Africa and general in Uganda in particular. Man. The guy is thought, and there is a film, by the way, called The Last King of Scotland with Forrest Whitaker. It is a grueling, intense film about this guy that apparently is pretty accurate. Took over in 1971, and the guy is thought to have probably been mentally retarded, cognitively deficient, IQ possibly in the 50s or 60s, but with like a ruthlessness to control people and willing to do almost anything that was able to dominate the society. Real interesting. I had a student named Alina Raji in the Congo, and just asking about a past, says, does your family live in the Congo a long time? Oh, no, my family moved from India to Uganda. And I said, oh my God, you were Asians in Uganda, and I'll bet your family left in the mid-70s. She said, I said, you are an Idi Amin Asian. So fascinating to meet somebody, because when Amin took over, he expelled all Asians who had settled, mostly Indian people, and kicked them out of the country. And Alina's family, who, the people that were there then had never really lived in India, they found another place in Africa to move to, and many settled in the Congo. He is thought to have murdered, sometimes under the most brutal and personal ways, murder and torture of 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 people. I believe this is confirmed that when his son was seen as betrayed him, he had his son executed and then ate his heart. This is sort of another level of violent, crazy, insane. Now, you might ask yourself, is this inherently more awful than white plantation owners in Haiti that were, burning their slaves alive, the conquistadors who were crucifying the indigenous people of Peru and Bolivia. There is human horror in many situations. Finally attempted to invade neighboring Tanzania, and this is where the surrounding countries took action. And in a moment of self-reflection, Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, probably my favorite of those independence leaders, said, ever since Idi Amin usurped power, he has murdered more people than the white racist governments in Rhodesia and South Africa. But we sort of play the game that it doesn't matter if Africans kill other Africans. And I think that's a very perceptive statement. Well, we don't want to criticize our own, and he's pointing out that we made a mistake by letting this happen. We should have been willing to call this guy out and put end to his reign of terror. Nigeria is the big part. It is the Brazil of Africa. Huge population. It says 140 million. That was 10 years ago. It might be 170, 180 million, and tremendously important because of its oil wealth. A lot of oil in Nigeria. Thought to be 200, 250 ethnic groups. Notice how straight these lines are. Well, the French and the English simply drew nice little neat lines without any concern for who is there. Major ethnic groups, you've got the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Hausa people in the northern part of the country. And this led to a separatist movement called the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War that lasted 3 years. And this, for many people, there was so much hope for Africa. There was so much of a sense of, we have these new leaders. They are breaking away from European domination. It's not going to be easy, but this is good. This is so long overdue. Maybe the world is finally making amends for the slave trade and for imperialism. And then seeing what happened as Nigeria split off, this horrific war that basically, lots of military casualties, guns and knives and machetes, but more than anything else, food was used as a weapon of war. And the area of Nigeria that was breaking away simply had food supplies completely cut off. And most estimates are, more than 1 million people, largely children, simply starved to death and were allowed to starve to death to break the rebellion. And this did make a lot of people think, man, it's going to be a harder road for the peoples of Africa than maybe we had hoped. And then the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, this was called the Belgian Congo. Well, it was the Congo Free State, and then was the Belgian Congo, and then became the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that was renamed Zaire for a while in the 1960s. Actually had, highest literacy rate in Africa. There is a sense that the Belgians had recognized, of course, that, wow, what King Leopold did was horrible, so we're going to do right by the Congolese. But just to give you an idea that even though, the literacy rate was pretty high, what I recall, I could have the number wrong, but I'm pretty close to being right, that at the time of independence in 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the same size as Western Europe minus Scandinavia, the size of the state of Texas, had 16 Congolese college graduates. So obviously it was a very low level of education, anything else. Yeah, again, 200 languages. Honestly, I've seen numbers say they're closer to 450, but 200, commonly spoken languages. And Patrice Lumumba took over in 1960. A guy that I admire an awful lot. But some questions about, did the wrong person take over? This is Lumumba's Independence Day speech, and you can stop and read it yourself because these are powerful words. But when the Belgian king was there, Belgian King Bedouin, his name was, grandson of Leopold, gave a speech about how, we Belgians have brought you people along and we've been good fathers to our children, but now it is your responsibility to show us what you can do. And Lumumba was infuriated by this. The idea that the Belgians had been the saviors and the fathers of the Congolese people after the horrors that we've already heard about and so forth. He stepped up and basically just said, you know what? You people have been horrific to us. You have been exploiting us. You have disrespected us. You have brutalized us. How dare you? How dare you? And, this, first of all, he's right. I don't think there's any way of arguing that the Belgians had been pretty darn good to the Congolese. And these are powerful and intense words. And at the same time, it certainly created among the Belgians and among others in the West kind of this guy speaks his mind, this guy is not going to be cooperative, and may have targeted him and his government as an enemy. He is eventually assassinated with Belgian officers that are there. It's actually people from the Western Congo Eastern Congo that specifically pulled the trigger. But there are Belgian officers there with help of the United States and the CIA. President Eisenhower specifically told the CIA head, let's get rid of this guy. This is the Cold War. We cannot rely upon him. Great film, by the way, called Lumumba. It is a very, very powerful and very accurate representation of his life. Strongly recommended. I would watch it with my Congolese students. As an icon of what's good or bad about African leaders. If I had a Patrice Lumumba poster, I would probably hang it up in any classroom that I had. He's also seen, don't think that legitimately, but as, well, here's just a crazy guy that took over. And the reality is we don't know. He had power for about 6 months, something like this, before he was arrested and eventually executed. We don't know what Patrice Lumumba would have turned out as. We don't know. After him was Joseph Désiré Mobutu, who eventually changed his name to Mobutu Sese Seko, led a military coup in 1965, and, was aware of the fact Lumumba was going to be executed. He ruled as the dictator for 32 years. Different numbers have suggested. This is where I talked about borrowing money. Well, he took out huge number of bank loans from Western countries for development projects. All we know is that Mobutu and his family probably ended up with $3, $4, $5, $7, $8, $10 billion in Western bank accounts. Simply, he borrowed the money for his country, threw a few dollars at the people, and put the rest in his own bank account. Now, you might ask, why would Western countries put up with this? Because he was not a communist. And when the United States said, we want you to say this, the United States was willing to say this. The reason that the Congo became Zaire is that he announced he would be Africanizing the society, where Christian names were banned. You simply had to take an African name. The country became named Zaire. His name went from being Joseph, Christian westernized name Mobutu, to being Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu eventually is overthrown in 1997. Worth looking at, the Human Development Index. It's one thing to say, well, what's the per capita income in a country? And that's great, except if there are 20 of us and the per capita income is $20 million and one of us makes $19,999,999 and the other 19 of us shares $1, well, we have desperate poverty, but per capita income looks good. So the Human Development Index is a way of measuring life expectancy, adult literacy rate, and college, high school, college, primary education, and per capita income based on the prices within a country. And it's a mathematical formula, has undergone revisions. It obviously doesn't capture the whole picture. I'm sure that if you get into, development work as you get older, you may find there are people very critical of it. But it's interesting sometimes to look at the HDI for countries as at least a snapshot of how the country is doing in terms of its people. So looking at Ghana today, 20 million people. Notice that's a huge percentage of the population under the age of 15. I should say this is all from about 15 years ago with the clear stop, etc. HDI ranking out of 180 countries, pretty low. Now, pretty good for sub-Saharan Africa, certainly a lot lower than, say, Bolivia, where I'm speaking from right now. Kenya, again, huge part of the population under 15. That's not only malleable, easily excitable people that are not economically contributing to the country now, but also people that are going to need homes and jobs and ways of supporting themselves. Again, the HDI ranking even lower than Ghana, pretty low. Uganda, again, HDI ranking pretty low. I forget his first name, Yoweri Museveni, took over in 1986. He was going to be one of the new democratic leaders of Uganda, and he's still in power 35 years later with allegations of fixing elections, etc. It is not the first time that a reforming new light has stepped in, created some positive change, and then just stayed on because one gets used to power. I think those of you in Bolivia might be familiar with a similar dynamic of that, and it's not unique to any individual. As they say, power tends to corrupt, but absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. Rwanda, we'll stop in a moment. It's a country that most of us would not have heard of. Most people only knew that there is a mountain gorilla population, one of the last in the world. Otherwise, just looks like another fairly poor part of Africa. But many know about the genocide in 1994. Again, there had been a history of antagonism between the two major groups. Now, some vantage points argue that historically it was fairly minor. Yeah, there's a difference between Tutsis and Hutus, but it was really with the arrival of the Europeans that those differences were expanded. The majority were Hutus, most of the population, but the Tutsis were the relatively small minority that were more educated, economically dominant, etc. The short story is that the Hutu president of Rwanda was killed as his plane was knocked out of the sky, and this led to an uprising in which Hutu extremists simply massacred hundreds of thousands, maybe some people say as many as 1 million. Tutsis and also more moderate Hutus were simply hacked to death with machetes, massive numbers within a 3-month period. And I remember this happening very clearly. I was just 29 years old. There were people on the ground from the United Nations, from others that saw this coming. They saw it coming. And the rest of the world just kind of didn't do much with it. Just kind of, we're concerned about this war in Iraq, and just not much happened. Well, it is especially tragic about this is not only the 900,000 people that were murdered. And again, if you want to find out more about, there's a lot of it. These are neighbors killing neighbors, family members killing family members. It became an absolute frenzy of mass extermination. But there are also a couple million people, both Tutsis escaping, but when a Tutsi army eventually took over, millions of Hutus start moving in, particularly into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which destabilizes the Congo and leads to what becomes known as Africa's World War, probably the bloodiest conflict since World War II. And it's directly related to this little tiny country and the genocide that occurred there. Why? Ethnic tensions? They were there. The Hutu government that is calling for people to massacre? Absolutely. Jared Diamond has argued, what this really is? It's an example of environmental decay because the population is growing and there's not enough land to support people. And these ethnic groups that had normally, historically gotten along okay with each other, wait a minute. Now that we're fighting over less and less land, and if they get it, we don't get it, that might have activists too. And again, the Security Council, the United Nations, one of the great failings, the warning signs were there, that responsibility to protect, and they simply did not respond. Yeah, you see some of the images here. Those are human bones on the right, human skulls. I believe that's in Congo, that refugee camp, etc. So, yeah, pretty nasty stuff. And there's a film called Hotel Rwanda that explains, it's the story of I believe a Hutu man that stands up for Tutsis and tries to protect people. He has, by the way, been arrested by the Kagame government that has taken over in Rwanda since then. sometimes the principled fighter for freedom, if he's not following directions, the next government may not care for him a lot. And the DR Congo, now 63 million today, I'm sure it's over 80 or 90 million, has one of the highest birth rates in the world. Notice that population, almost half below the age of 15. That is a marker for an unstable society. HDI ranking pretty much at the bottom. And you know what? It hasn't gotten better. I knew people that worked at the school that although they actually had jobs, they actually had, at least by local standards, reasonable paying jobs, they didn't eat 3 meals a day or anything close to it. We had a driver our first year there to take Seffi to her preschool, which was off the campus that we lived on. His name was Bosco, a real gentleman, delightful man. The second year, we simply could not hire him. Like, we didn't leave campus very often. And he knew this ahead of time. Learned that he had, we knew that he had 5 children. He had to decide which one of the 5 was going to be able to go to school. And my friend Ricky, that named his son after us, Ricky said, Robert, when he told me this, I just broke down crying. And, we tried to help Bosco, and we'd send him a few $100s for Christmas. Occasionally we'd hear from him that his son had malaria. But the need was so great in this place. Poverty is absolutely brutal in parts of Bolivia, and it's serious. And there's a whole other level in the DR Congo. And you know what? What I'm told is the parts of the country that I didn't get to, I wouldn't even recognize as bad as things were. So the poverty rate, God only knows how high it is. Mobutu was finally thrown in 1977. And actually, in the last couple of years, the Kabila family no longer rules directly Bolivia. Overthrew Mobutu in 1997. He is actually assassinated, I believe, in 2001. His son Joseph took over. Joseph eventually allowed free elections to happen about 2 years ago, 2019, I think it was, although it's understood to have been a fixed election. And in effect, the Kabila family still controls the country economically, kind of is the power behind the throne of the current president. Degrees of separation, Joseph Kabila, the 17-year president of the Congo, his daughter was one of my students in the Congo. And you know what? A very bright, very decent, very thoughtful. I liked her a lot. I think the bottom line is, like, how could she live with a man of a dictator? Well, you know what? He was daddy. And very, very complicated. I think she was under a lot of pressure because I think she understood some things about her father's government. The Congo today, this response, it's often called Africa's World War. In the last 20 years, all of the Rwandan refugees spilling into the DR Congo ended up destabilizing the Mobutu government. It's something we could spend, months of our time talking about. But what ultimately happened is the entire eastern half of the Congo became unbelievably unstable. And you know what? 8 African countries sent soldiers in, well, to protect their borders, but also the Congo is famous for its mineral wealth. Rwanda, next door, this little tiny country, Rwanda one year, I think, produced something like $8 million worth of diamonds, and yet it exported $200 million worth of diamonds. Well, where is it coming from? It's coming from their sponsored militias in the Congo that is taking the resources of the Congo. There are not only 8 countries there, I say 25 armed militias. You know what? Let's call it 50. Let's call it 75. Let's call it 200. A new group forms every day. Whose sides are they on? You know what? It depends what's on their interest. Bottom line, you see probably estimates 5, 6, 4 million, who knows, dead since 1998. Again, not so, yes, in some cases from absolute slaughter, militias coming into an area, burning, attacking, but it's also massive, massive starvation as people need to leave an area and they have nothing. Turned out the major crop there, kind of like corn is in Mexico or potatoes are in Ireland, was a root vegetable called cassava, Well, cassava, as it turns out, you need to actually soak it in water before eating, or it has a poison in it. Well, people desperately leaving as the armed conflict was coming, gathering together crops, eating it because they were hungry, was killing people. 4, 5, 6 million people, you tell me, and rape as a political weapon. There is a doctor, Dr. Dennis Makumbe, I believe his name is, who is a incredible gynecological surgeon who has set up, and he's received multiple death threats. I'm amazed that he's still alive, has basically healed tens of thousands of women who have been absolutely brutalized by crops. And you might notice by the soldiers coming in, and you might notice when we talk about these vicious, bloodthirsty soldiers, there's one of them in the middle, child soldiers. And there are horrific stories in which a child is kidnapped, forced into a militia group, and then brought back to his own area and is forced to kill his own family. Well, once you put a 12-year-old kid with a machine gun in a situation where he has just murdered his own parents, is there any conscience left? Is there any right and wrong left? There isn't. Congo is probably, going back the last 150 years, maybe the single most tragic place on earth. Man, some of these people are just beautiful, though. I made friends there like I haven't met before. Life is complicated. Life is complicated. South Africa is one that many know. Remember, it's a little bit different. Excuse me, I got to close a door that's blowing open in the breeze. Initially settled by the Dutch. These are people called Boers. I used to think it was Boers, and a Boer student of mine in South Africa says, Mr. Ziegler, we're not Boers, we're Boers. And I guess that sounds better, because Boers sounds like boring people. So these were Dutch settlers, hard scrabble farmers, and then eventually the British came along with their more sophisticated technology and, simply more money to spend. And they took over the colony itself. But there was always conflict between the British settlers, the rulers, and not only the Africans, but the Boer people as well. South Africa was given its independence in 1910, but notice I have a second date of this, because this was a minority government. This was an all-white government. A nationalist party in 1948 set up what were called apartheid laws. You know what these were? Separate laws. If you have white skin, you can do this. If you're part of the 85% black majority, you can do this. And extreme limitations, tremendous wealth, diamonds and golds, etc. It was a wealthy first world country for the 12% white population, whereas the black population lived almost exclusively in horrific poverty, and the wealth was on the backs of the black population. And before Americans like me can judge, did we not see that in the United States? How different is apartheid and the Jim Crow laws in the United States? There's a lot more similarities than differences. Yeah, again, Afrikaners are a Boer. Afrikaner is actually a Dutch-ish language, etc. People classified by race. I mean, natives, Indians, and coloreds, if you enter, you'll be listed as missing. You'll be shot on sight. This is not on some idiot's website. This is official government policy and simply how it worked. You might ask how the United States, that believes in freedom and equality and justice, why would we tolerate this? Because the white South African government was absolutely, vehemently anti-communist. And again, the Soviet Union was more than happy to support really nasty people who were communists. So again, it goes both ways. But the idea that, the United States or Soviet Union was trying to create a better world for the... Give me a break. It's self-interest, and it's self-interest. The African National Congress, I don't know if you recognize that face at the bottom. It's a face that you've seen, but probably not when he was 25 years old. That's Nelson Mandela, who's become, died about 7-8 years ago, but one of the sort of great heroes of the 20th century. The African National Congress is set up to fight for that 88% black majority. And it began as a non-movement, as a Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, nonviolence. But after a major massacre in 1960, where a poor township of South Africa, soldiers simply come in and start firing, and they just massacre people. They shoot them in the back. Really, the African National Congress says, you know what? We have to be willing to use violence. We can't fight this. We need to be targeting buses. We need to be setting off bombs. You can call all you want for nonviolence. It's not going to work. And, it's kind of hard to argue against that. Also, not hard to argue if your child is killed in the school bus bombing, that maybe that's, it's complicated for sure. Nelson Mandela is one of its leaders and spends 27 years imprisoned at Robben Island Prison off of Cape Town. But there you see Mandela. And there is the Mandela as he was better known as an elder statesman. Wealthiest country in Africa, no question about it. GDP per capita. If you are a white South African, although there certainly are poor whites like you see in the United States and elsewhere, came fairly close to being first world. However, for the black majority, 85, close to 90%, 88% sticks to mind. No spending in education, couldn't work in certain areas. You had to have a certain pass to go around. You were harassed by the police, and there was also an attempt to set up homelands. These are basically ghettos where the black population will live, and they must live there, and they can't live among us. 1960, this is what the African National Congress as a group said. We need to start using violence. 69 black protesters are killed by white police and mostly just shot in the back. So this is one of those trigger moments that leads the African National Congress that, some had always been arguing. You can't fight against violent animals like this only using peace and love. But there was something about this that was so stark, you see that the aftermath was caught on film, that the majority within the African National Congress said, you know what, violence is going to be necessary. It'd be nice if it weren't, but it is necessary. You start seeing massive oppression, the enforcement of apartheid, major riots in 1976 in another township around Johannesburg, kills a lot of children. And again, the fact that people are seeing this, and the fact that the United States had been through its civil rights movement. Stephen Biko, who was an African nationalist, a very outspoken leader, he's arrested for the 38th time or something like that. And they announced the next day, the white authorities, he died in prison. Well, he was beaten to death. His head was crushed in. And this, again, leads to just massive sense. There is an incredible, I wish I had an image of it, but an incredible photograph of masses of South Africans by the tens of thousands that are marching, and they're holding up a sign saying, "You can't kill us all." Pretty intense stuff. By the 1980s, this became a major political movement. By the 1960s, the UN General Assembly said apartheid is wrong. There was a voluntary arms embargo that was made mandatory by the 1960s, 70s, and then a divestment movement calling on companies, universities to stop investing in South Africa. Now, with some countries, this may not work. There are some countries like Myanmar in Asia where the generals that have run Myanmar said, fine, we don't want outsiders, they corrupt us. South African whites did. They consider themselves a part of Europe. And if they were being cut off and not allowed to travel and investment wasn't coming in, it led the South African government to start saying, we've got to make some changes. In 1990, a major moment, Nelson Mandela is released from prison for the first time in my life because he was sentenced to prison the same year that I was born. They hold full multiracial elections in 1994, and to the surprise of nobody, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress wins the election. There is a black majority government. Mandela, to his credit, said this is not a time to get revenge. We need to find a way to work together with the black majority and the white minority. But do understand that going into this, that the average white South African was educated, fairly wealthy, had a long history and family connections of fairly wealthy people, and the vast majority of South Africans were desperately, desperately poor. And one of the things that liberation movements have discovered, you can have all the laws on the book calling for equality that you want to, but if people are economically desperate, it only goes so far. South Africa's population, again, about a decade ago, big population. Notice a more developed country, so lower percentage under the age of 15. Life expectancy, that was HIV AIDS that hit South Africa like no place else. Better human development index rating, GDP per capita. Hey, that's pretty high. Except it was controlled by a very small part of the population. Look at the poverty rate, 50%, and you could probably argue it's even higher than that. I am not going to, if I was showing you a film called The Battle of Algiers, which we just don't have time to this year, I'm going to skip through this, but Algeria would be of some interest to you. I don't think we need to look at it now. This is going to be very close. I think we have a few more slides left only. Yeah, and then in the last decade, I guess this wouldn't appear on the AP exam, but it's worth looking at, the Arab Spring. This was not spontaneous. It spread from one country to the next, from Tunisia to Egypt to countries in the Middle East. You know what? 15 different countries that began to protest led to the overthrow of long-standing dictatorships. To the present, things have stabilized a lot, but this is still a part of our current reality. And, unknowable. When I put this slide together in 2010, was this going to be an earth-changing, wow, it changed the political culture of North Africa and led to lasting changes in the Middle East. And I'll tell you what, in 2095, are we still talking about this in history courses? Or is it something that had a lot of promise, but eventually just kind of petered off into no major changes? And hard to know where we are. Yeah, all the countries you're seeing here saw major protests, and in some of these countries, overthrowing of long-standing governments. Ben Ali, who had been a dictator for over 27 years in Tunisia, was forced to leave. The Mubarak regime since 1980 was overthrown. Yemen, which is involved in a horrific civil war today, overthrown. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya had been in charge for 35 years. He was forced out. Ongoing rebellions in other states. And, I guess right now in the short term by 2021, we could say, are all of these societies better off? No, probably not. There is major instability in Libya and in Yemen. There is a new military dictatorship in Egypt. Economic problems in many of them, etc. I don't know that we can really say in the short run these are positive changes, but of course history has a long arc. Why? Well, dictatorships, the corruption, the human rights violations. By the way, WikiLeaks, you might know the name Julian Assange. Julian Assange is I believe, Australian who basically was able to get access to a whole bunch of secret cables and messages from the U.S. and other governments, and he just plain released them, which exposed some of the corruption, hypocrisy. The desperation, oh, absolutely, the poverty, the unemployment. You had Egyptians who went off to university and simply couldn't find any type of a job at all. This is a Facebook revolution where text messaging and Facebook spreads absolutely. And the trigger was, I can't believe that was 10 years ago now, but Mohamed Bouazizi, you'll see him in just a moment, is a young Tunisian fruit vendor who kept getting harassed by the police. They would grab him, punch him up, take his money, and walk off. And he got so frustrated with this, he publicly set fire to himself. And this was just this intense moment that led Tunisians to say, enough is enough. And when Tunisia overthrew its government, it happened in others. Is this real change, or is it just, well, the new boss, same as the old boss? What's going to happen to the economies of these societies? What takes over next? These are mostly Muslim countries, of course. Are we going to see fundamentalist Islamic forces or democracies? What about the role of women and U.S.-Israeli relations? Oh my goodness, so much that comes with this. We don't have the answers now. And then you see the final images, Yemeni Nobel Peace Prize winner. There's Mohammed Bouazizi, who again set himself on fire in his complete desperation. It was Time Magazine's Person of the Year, the protester from across the world. Yeah, fascinating. Still, a part of the world, and this is where, is this Africa? Is it the Middle East? And the answer is yes. It's Africa. It's the Middle East. Culturally, a lot of links, especially in North Africa. All right, tried to get this in at less than an hour. It looks like I went over by 5 minutes. I believe this is the final slide.